Okay, we're going to talk more about field properties. In the last video, we talked about field properties with text-based fields. We're going to look more at field properties with date, time, and number fields. And I'm going to do that by looking at the service events table. So if I go to that and go to Design, View, and you'll see in here, again, we have an auto number field at the top. That's the primary key. Again, we really don't want to change anything in here for those field properties down here. Organization name is a number, but you'll recall that this is actually a link to the organization's table. So sometimes we want to change number properties, but the reason I know this is a link, if I go here, you have the General tab and you have the Lookup tab. The Lookup tab is actually looking at the organization's table, selecting the primary key, the ID, and the organization name in order that it could create that pick list where we selected an organization. Generally, I don't want to change anything in here either. In fact, if I tried to change this and change it to, instead of a long integer, change it to a byte field, which is a shorter field for holding a number, it says I can't change it because the data type or field size, you can't change the data type or field size because it is part of one or more relationships. And if we looked at our relationships window, we'd see, oh yeah, that was the link between the two tables. So don't try and change something like that. With date time, our event date, there are some things in here we could change if we wanted to. If I go down here to format, again, format is the display of the field. And you get some options in here in the pick list. And these are some options for displaying the date. So maybe your users would want to see a date and a time. Maybe they'd want to see everything spelled out. Maybe they'd only want the time. Those are some options in there. With our event date, normally we probably would care about the time, and we could enter a time and display that. So I'm going to set that as general date. And something very important to remember is that even though you can change the format to display the date in several different ways, the underlying data in the table does not change. So the data in the table actually does not change, even though you can change the way it's displayed in several different ways using the format. With input mask, you get some options in here, just like you would if you had a phone number or a zip code. In this case, I don't think it makes sense to use any of those, so I'm going to cancel out of that. Caption, again, is just like with text fields, it's a label for the field that might be more user-friendly than just the field name. Default value could be a default that's always placed in the field. Since event dates would be unique for different kinds of events, we probably wouldn't ever have a default for that. But I just want to show something in here. If I go to default value, click over here, and you see this expression builder like we saw in the text when I was discussing text. There actually is an interesting set of functions in here. And if I click there, you'll see different types of functions. One example of a date time function, which we would use with the date time field, you see different options here. There's something called, if we go down now, and if I use that, it would, as a default, return a variant of type date specifying the current system date and time. So if I set that in there, and the way I would set it in there, I'm on now and just double click it. It's now added it up in here in the builder area here. It's added now. I'm going to click OK. And it's saying the default value equal now. And I'll show you in a minute what that does. Validation rule. I'm not going to set one up, but something you might want to do with that, with an event date, it would always be a future date. So if you wanted to prevent the users from entering a date not in the past, then you could set up a validation rule. And again, you work with the functions here, and you might say the date must be greater than now or something like that. I'm not going to show that just at the moment. But the other fields here should look familiar from the text field. You could make it required, and an event date normally should be required. So we're going to make that yes. I'm going to save the table and go to datasheet view. It's going to ask if I want to save. I say yes. And you'll get this warning message. It's really just a warning that you've changed that there's already data in your table, and now after the fact you're changing some of the rules about how the data needs to be entered, and that may affect existing data. I'm not going to worry about that for now. I'm just going to say yes. And if I expand this, you'll see here, as a default, if I'm adding a new record, what it did here, I'm working on this module. It's June 2nd of 2015, 4:08 in the afternoon. It's added as a default for a new row now, the exact time right now when I was creating this video. In some cases, it would be very useful to put the current date. Like I said, for this, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But before I get off of here, I want to show you can actually add the time. So say like this event that's going to be on October 15th of 2015, I could add the time. Maybe it's 3 p.m. I can add it like that. And there, it knew how to capture that. And it says that this event will be on 10/10 at 3 p.m. I'm going to go back here on the design and get rid of that now field. It doesn't make sense for us to have it with the event date. I do want to talk about the number and currency field a little bit and some of the properties you find in there. So with the number field, we've got a field here, number of volunteers, and you look at number, and you get some options with field size. And if I pull up the drop-down list here, you see different options. One of the links in my glossary shows what these different options are. So you can see it here. Byte is actually a smaller field. It only holds integers up to 255 and only holds positive numbers from 0 to 255. Integer holds more data, and the range is negative 32,000 plus to 32,000 as a positive number. The long integer is even longer and gets into the millions. So you have to think about what you're going to store in the field and whether these different numeric data types make sense. The single and double are for floating point values. In other words, fields that hold decimal points. And the decimal field also holds decimal points. For right now, don't worry about the replication ID. We're going to go back to our database. And the one thing I would change in here, the number of volunteers, this is the number of student volunteers. Do we really need a long integer field which would hold up to millions of volunteers? That's really not going to happen. In this case, I'm going to make it a byte field which holds up to 255. If we really needed something longer, Microsoft Access does have the flexibility, especially to change to something larger. If we tried to change it to something smaller, it could have problems with that. But I'm going to change it to a byte field. And decimal places doesn't make sense here. It's an integer field. I'm going to leave that as is. I'm going to look at something with currency. You have some options in here too. With currency, you have some options to display it in, for instance, in euros, European currency, or you could do it as a fixed number with decimal places. You could do it as a percent field, scientific notation, get lots of options in here. I actually want to do it as a, let's say, fixed. And what I want to do is set the number of decimal points to 2. So it's always going to display currency with 2 decimal places. Default value, let's pretend that maybe the default for funds that needed might be $500. Let's put that in. And I'm going to save this and look at the data sheet. And you can see here what it's done over here with funds needed. It's giving me my decimal point, and it's given me 2 decimal places. You'll actually notice that the $ is not there, and I'll show you why. If I go back to design view, instead of saying fixed, let's put it back at currency. When I changed it to fixed, I got rid of the $, and maybe I don't want to do that. Let's go back and put it at currency, keep it at 2 decimal places. Let's look at it. And there we go. We've got $, we've got 2 decimal places, and we've got a new row. Default is $500.